Some children are born into love, while others must wait for love to find them. For two 6-year-old twin girls abandoned in the Wyoming Territory, that love would come from the most unlikely source. Josiah Brennan was a lonely cowboy who had given up on caring for anyone but his cattle. He lived alone on his weathered ranch, believing his heart had grown cold after years of loss. But on a November morning in 1873, he found the twins sitting on a wooden crate outside an empty homestead. Their stepmother had disappeared, leaving only a note and 2 frightened children. It was planned to take them to town the next day, but a storm rolled in. One night of shelter turned into something that would change all their lives forever. Could a man who had forgotten how to love become the father these girls needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Josiah Brennan pulled on his worn leather boots and stepped onto the front porch of his ranch house. The November air bit at his weathered face, carrying the scent of frost and the promise of winter's approach. At 52, Joss had developed a routine as predictable as the seasons themselves. Rise before dawn, check the cattle, mend what needed mending, and speak to no one unless absolutely necessary. His ranch stretched across 200 acres of Wyoming territory, a modest spread by some standards, but more than enough for a man who valued solitude above all else. The house itself was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs and practical design, built for function rather than comfort. A single chair sat on the porch, where Joss would sometimes smoke his pipe in the evenings, watching the sun disappear behind the distant mountains. The cattle were his only companions now, and he preferred it that way. They demanded nothing more than feed, water, and protection from predators, a fair exchange that required no conversation, no promises, and certainly no emotional entanglements. Judd had learned the hard way that caring too deeply only led to heartbreak. Inside the house, tucked away in a wooden box beneath his narrow bed, lay a worn leather journal filled with entries from another life. The pages chronicled a different man entirely, one who had believed in love, in family, in the possibility of happiness. That man had married sweet Mary Catherine Brennan in the spring of 1865, built this very house with dreams of filling it with children's laughter, and planned a future that stretched as wide as the Wyoming sky. The first entry, written in a younger hand with careful attention to penmanship, read, "Married my darling Mary today. She looks like an angel in her mother's dress. We'll build something beautiful here, something lasting." The entries that followed documented their early happiness, Mary's garden taking root in the rocky soil, their first successful cattle purchase, plans for adding rooms to accommodate the children they hoped would come. For 3 years, they had tried for those children. Mary would place her hand on her flat belly each month with such hope in her eyes that Joss began to believe her optimism could will a baby into existence. They attended church regularly in those days, praying with the kind of faith that assumes God is listening and planning good things. Mary would hum while she cooked, her voice floating through the house like a blessing. The journal entries from that period radiated contentment. "Mary's biscuits are getting better, only burned the bottoms a little today. She laughed when I told her I'd eat them anyway," or found her talking to the cattle today, asking them to be patient while we figure things out. "Lord, I love that woman." Then came the winter of 1868. Mary had finally conceived, and Joss threw himself into preparations with the devotion of a man who believed he was building heaven on earth. He crafted a cradle from the finest wood he could find, reinforced the house against drafts, and made plans to hire a woman from town to help during the birth. The baby came early, during a blizzard that lasted 3 days. Joss couldn't reach town for help, and Mary labored alone, except for his inexperienced hands. The child, a boy they never got to name, lived for only 2 hours. Mary held him while the storm raged outside, singing lullabies to a son who would never hear her voice again. The journal entry from that day consisted of only 5 words, written in shaking handwriting. God took them both today. Mary never recovered from the birth. She lingered for 6 weeks, growing weaker despite Joss's desperate care. The woman who had once hummed while cooking now stared silently out the window, her spirit as broken as her body. Joss read to her from the Bible, made her favorite foods that she wouldn't eat, and promised her things would get better, lies they both recognized but were too kind to acknowledge. She died on a Tuesday morning in February, when the ground was too frozen to dig a proper grave. Joss had to wait until spring to bury his wife and son in the small plot behind the house, marked now by 2 simple wooden crosses that he maintained with religious devotion. The remaining pages of the journal were mostly blank. Joss had tried to continue writing, to document his grief and perhaps find a path through it, but words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his loss. The few entries that existed were fragments. Sold 30 head today. Need the money. Or fixed the roof leak in Mary's, in the bedroom. After the burial, Joss had made a deliberate choice to embrace isolation. He stopped attending church, stopped visiting town except when absolutely necessary, and built walls around his heart as sturdy as the ones around his property. The neighbors had tried to help at first, bringing casseroles he didn't eat, offering companionship he didn't want, suggesting he might find love again with the right woman. Joss had received these overtures politely but firmly, making it clear that his grieving period would be permanent. The years that followed had settled into a comfortable numbness. Joss developed skills in solitude that served him well. He could cook simple meals, tend minor injuries, and maintain his property without assistance. He read by lamplight in the evenings, mostly books about cattle ranching and weather patterns, subjects that offered practical knowledge without emotional complications. His reputation in the territory was that of a capable but remote man. Other ranchers respected his expertise with cattle and his honesty in business dealings, but they had learned not to expect warmth or friendship. Joss paid his debts, kept his word, and minded his own business, qualities that earned respect in Wyoming territory, where personal space was considered sacred. The neighboring homesteads were scattered across the landscape like islands, each family carving out their own piece of the frontier dream. The Milliken family lived 5 miles east, with 4 young children who sometimes waved when they passed Joss's property. The Weatherbys had claimed land to the south, an older couple who had come west after losing their farm in Kansas. To the north, the old Henderson place had been vacant for 2 years now, ever since consumption claimed both parents and left their homestead to slowly surrender to the elements. Joss knew these details not because he socialized with his neighbors, but because information traveled naturally in sparse country. A nod at the general store, a brief exchange while purchasing supplies, the occasional shared work during roundup season. These minimal interactions provided enough information to stay informed without becoming involved. On this particular November morning, as Joss walked through his daily routine, he noticed something unusual. No smoke rose from the chimney of the Henderson place, which wasn't surprising since the house had been empty for so long. But something about the property looked different, and though he couldn't immediately identify what had caught his attention, Joss prided himself on observation, a skill essential for successful ranching and comfortable solitude. He could read weather patterns in cloud formations, assess cattle health from their posture, and notice subtle changes in his environment that might signal trouble. This morning, that finely tuned awareness was telling him something was amiss at the Henderson homestead. He completed his morning chores with unusual haste, the nagging feeling growing stronger as the sun climbed higher. The cattle were fed and watered, the fences checked and the equipment secured, but Joss found himself repeatedly glancing toward the Henderson place. By mid-morning, his curiosity had overwhelmed his preference for minding his own business. Joss saddled his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, who had served him faithfully for 8 years. Duchess was as suited to solitude as her owner, content to work without fuss and equally comfortable with long stretches of silence. As they rode toward the Henderson property, Joss told himself he was simply being neighborly. Checking on an empty house was the decent thing to do, even for a man who preferred his own company. The Henderson homestead sat in a small valley sheltered by cottonwoods that had turned golden with autumn. The house itself was modest but well built, constructed by a man who had intended it to last generations. A small barn stood nearby, and behind the house lay the remnants of what had once been Martha Henderson's pride, a vegetable garden that had fed her family and provided surplus for trading. As Joss approached, he could see that someone had indeed been at the property recently. Tracks in the dirt suggested a wagon had been there, and the front door stood slightly ajar, unusual for a house that had been securely closed for 2 years. Joss dismounted and approached cautiously, his hand instinctively checking the position of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. The source of his unease became clear as he rounded the corner of the house. There, sitting on an overturned wooden crate beside the front steps, were 2 small figures that made Joss stop short in amazement. 2 little girls, identical in every way he could see, sat huddled together against the morning chill. They couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with tangled auburn hair and faces streaked with tears and dirt. At the sight of Joss, both children scrambled to their feet, instinctively moving closer together. Their eyes were wide, with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that struck Joss like a physical blow. They wore simple dresses that had once been clean, but were now wrinkled and stained, and their feet were shod in worn boots that seemed too large for their small frames. "Hello there," Joss said softly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect he hadn't used in years. His voice sounded rusty from disuse, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "Are you girls all right?" Neither child spoke, but the one on the left, slightly taller and with a more defiant set to her shoulders, stepped protectively in front of her sister. Joss recognized the stance of someone who had learned to be wary of strangers, and his heart clenched with unexpected sympathy. "I'm Joss Brennan," he continued, crouching down to reduce his imposing height. "I live on the ranch just over that ridge. Are you waiting for someone?" The protective twin finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said she'd come back. Who said she'd come back, honey?" "Mama Ruth," the second twin added, her voice even smaller than her sister's. "She said to wait right here and not to wander off. And she'd come back for us." Joss felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. He glanced around the property, noting the absence of any other human presence, the silence that suggested abandonment rather than temporary absence. "How long have you been waiting?" The twins exchanged a look that seemed to contain an entire conversation. "Since yesterday morning," the first girl admitted. "Maybe longer. We slept here last night." Joss closed his eyes briefly, processing this information and its implications. 2 6-year-old children, alone overnight in November weather, waiting for someone who clearly wasn't coming back. The situation was worse than he could have imagined, and it demanded immediate action, despite every instinct in his body screaming at him to avoid this kind of complication. "What are your names?" he asked gently. "I'm Ivy," said the protective one. "This is Rose. We're twins." "I can see that," Joss replied, managing a small smile. "Ivy and Rose, those are beautiful names. Like flowers." "Mama said we were her little garden," Rose offered, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "But Mama's been gone a long time. Mama Ruth isn't really our Mama." Joss felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together, none of them forming a picture he liked. A stepmother, perhaps, who had brought the children to this remote location and then abandoned them. The scenario was unfortunately common in the territories, where people often reinvented themselves and shed inconvenient responsibilities. "Is there a note or anything that Mama Ruth left for you?" Joss asked. Though he suspected he already knew the answer, Ivy nodded and pulled a folded piece of paper from her dress pocket. The paper was wrinkled and damp, as if it had been handled many times. Joss accepted it carefully and unfolded it, reading words that confirmed his worst fears about the situation these children faced. The note was written in a hurried hand, the ink smeared in places as if tears had fallen on the paper while it was still wet. Joss read it silently first, his expression growing darker with each line, then read it again to make sure he understood the full scope of what these children were facing. To whoever finds these girls, the note began, I can't take care of them anymore. Their daddy died of fever last month, and I got my own troubles to worry about. They're good girls mostly, just need feeding and watching. I left what food I could spare. I'm going to California where my sister lives. Don't try to follow me. Ruth Caldwell. Joss folded the note carefully, his hands trembling slightly with controlled anger. In just a few sentences, this woman had reduced two human beings to the status of abandoned livestock, left with a casual cruelty that took his breath away. He looked at the twins, who were watching his face intently, trying to read their fate in his expression. What did it say? Ivy asked. Though her voice suggested she already suspected the worst, Joss considered his words carefully. These children had already endured more than any child should, and he wouldn't add to their burden with unnecessary harshness. It says that Mama Ruth had to go away, and she wanted to make sure someone would take care of you. It wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that Ruth Caldwell had discarded these children like inconvenient baggage, with no more thought than she might give to abandoning a broken wagon wheel. The whole truth was that Ivy and Rose were now orphans in every sense that mattered, dependent on the kindness of strangers in a territory where survival was never guaranteed. Is she coming back? Rose asked, her voice small and hopeful. Joss met her eyes and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, regardless of how it turned out. No, sweetheart. She's not coming back. The words hit both girls like physical blows. Ivy's jaw tightened, and she pulled Rose closer, while Rose's face crumpled as she began to cry silently. Joss felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like ice breaking on a winter pond. He had spent 5 years building walls around his heart, and these two small girls had just punched a hole straight through them. But you don't have to worry, Joss continued, his voice gentler than it had been in years. I'm not going to leave you here alone. We're going to figure this out together. You don't even know us, Ivy said, suspicion clear in her voice. At 6 years old, she had already learned that adults' promises often meant nothing. That's true, Joss admitted. But I know you're cold and probably hungry, and you shouldn't be out here by yourselves. My ranch isn't far, and I've got food and a warm fire. We can start there. As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a storm. Joss glanced at the sky, noting the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. November weather in Wyoming territory could turn deadly without warning, and spending another night outdoors would be dangerous for children this young. Did Ruth leave any belongings for you? Joss asked, looking around the property. Ivy pointed to a threadbare satchel sitting beside the wooden crate. Just that. It's got our other dresses and some food that's mostly gone. Joss picked up the satchel, surprised by its lightness. Everything these children owned in the world fit in a bag he could carry with one hand. The thought struck him as profoundly wrong. Children should have treasures and keepsakes, favorite toys and comfortable clothes. They should have roots and security, not a life that could be packed in a single small bag. All right, he said, shouldering the satchel. Let's get you two somewhere warm. The girls exchanged another of those silent conversations, communicating in the way that only twins could. Finally, Ivy nodded. We'll come with you, she said formally, as if granting him a great favor. But we can take care of ourselves if we need to. I'm sure you can, Joss replied seriously. You've been doing a brave job so far. As they prepared to leave, Joss took one last look around the Henderson homestead. The empty house seemed to watch them with sad windows, a monument to dreams that had ended too soon. He wondered if Martha and Thomas Henderson had ever imagined their property would serve as the setting for another family's tragedy. The ride back to Joss's ranch was conducted mostly in silence. He had lifted both girls onto Duchess's broad back, where they sat clinging to each other and stealing glances at their rescuer. Joss walked alongside, leading the horse and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened to his carefully ordered life. For 5 years, He had lived according to rigid principles designed to protect him from exactly this kind of emotional vulnerability. He avoided children because they reminded him of his own loss. He avoided responsibility for others because responsibility led to caring, and caring led to heartbreak. Most of all, he avoided hope because hope was the cruelest lie of all. Now, in the span of one morning, all those defenses had been stripped away. He was walking home with 2 orphaned children who were counting on him for survival. And he had no idea what he was doing. As they crested the ridge that overlooked his ranch, Josh saw his property through the girl's eyes. The house looked smaller and more weathered than usual, the yard rougher around the edges. It was a home built for solitude, not for children. There was no garden like Martha Henderson's had been, no swing hanging from the old oak tree, no signs that anyone had ever lived there who cared about beauty or comfort. "Is that your house?" Rose asked, speaking for the first time since they'd left the Henderson place. "Yes, it is. It looks lonesome," she observed, with the startling honesty that children possessed. Joss considered this assessment and found it accurate. "I suppose it does," he admitted. "I'm used to living alone." "We won't be any trouble," Ivy said quickly. "We can sleep anywhere and we don't eat much." The words hit Joss like a physical blow, revealing the depth of these children's experience with being unwanted. What kind of life had they lived that made a 6-year-old girl feel the need to apologize for existing, to promise she would take up as little space as possible? "You won't be any trouble," Joss said firmly. "And you'll sleep in proper beds and eat proper meals. That's what children are supposed to have." By the time they reached the house, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Joss helped the girls down from Duchess and led them up the front steps, suddenly seeing his home with fresh eyes. The porch needed sweeping, the windows could use a good cleaning, and the interior was strictly functional, a place where a man slept and ate and waited for the next day to begin. As Joss opened the front door, he realized he was about to cross a threshold in more ways than one. Once these children entered his house, his life would never be the same. The careful isolation he had built would be shattered, and he would have to remember how to be human in ways that went beyond mere survival. The girls stepped inside cautiously, taking in their surroundings with wide eyes. The main room was sparsely furnished, a table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, shelves lined with practical books. Everything was clean but impersonal, the home of a man who had forgotten how to live rather than merely exist. "It's warm," Rose said with genuine appreciation. "And it smells like coffee and leather," Ivy added. Not unkindly, Joss looked at his home through their eyes and felt ashamed. There was nothing here to comfort children, no bright colors, no soft spaces, no signs that joy had ever lived within these walls. But it was shelter, and it was safe, and for now, that would have to be enough. Outside, the wind was picking up, and the snow was beginning to fall in earnest. The storm that had been threatening all morning was finally arriving, and Joss felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because the weather would force him to keep the girls, at least overnight. He had a legitimate excuse to postpone the difficult decisions about their future. Terror because every hour they stayed, every moment of comfort he provided, would make it harder to eventually let them go. As he watched Ivy and Rose explore their temporary sanctuary, Joss realized that the wooden crate where he had found them would be remembered as the place where 3 lives changed forever. Not just theirs, but his as well. After 5 years of emotional hibernation, Josiah Brennan was about to discover whether his heart was truly dead or simply waiting for the right reason to beat again. Joss woke before dawn, as was his habit, but for the first time in 5 years, he lay still in bed instead of immediately rising. The events of the previous day felt like a dream. Surely he hadn't really brought 2 orphaned children into his home, hadn't promised to care for them, hadn't felt his carefully guarded heart crack open at their plight. But the soft sounds of breathing from the main room confirmed the reality of his situation. He had given the girls his bed while he made do with blankets by the fireplace, and now he could hear them stirring in the pre-dawn darkness. The storm had raged through the night, dropping several inches of snow and making any trip to town impossible for at least another day. Joss rose quietly and stoked the fire, trying not to wake his unexpected guests. But as he moved about the kitchen preparing coffee, he heard whispered conversation from the bedroom. "Do you think he's going to send us away?" Rosie's voice was barely audible. "I don't know," Ivy replied, her protective instincts evident even in whisper. "He seems nice enough, but grown-ups change their minds sometimes." "I like the soup he made," Rose said. "It was almost as good as real Mama's." Joss paused in his coffee preparation, struck by the casual reference to their deceased mother. These children had already endured more loss than many adults, yet they faced each new day with a resilience that amazed him. He cleared his throat softly to announce his presence and called out, "Good morning, girls. Are you awake?" There was a rustling sound, then Ivy's voice. "Yes, sir." "No need for sir," Joss said gently. "Just Joss will do fine. Are you hungry?" The response was immediate and enthusiastic from both girls. Joss smiled, the first genuine smile to cross his face in longer than he cared to remember. Children's appetites, at least, were something he could understand and address. As he began preparing breakfast, Joss realized how ill-equipped his kitchen was for feeding children. His meals consisted of coffee, bacon, beans, and the occasional biscuit when he felt ambitious. He had no idea what 6-year-old girls typically ate, or whether his rough fare would be suitable for them. The girls emerged from the bedroom looking rumpled, but more rested than they had the day before. Both wore the same dresses from yesterday, apparently the only clean clothes in their meager satchel. Joss made a mental note to add children's clothing to his growing list of necessities he'd never had to consider before. "The snow's pretty deep out there," Joss observed, glancing out the window. "Looks like we'll be staying put for at least another day." He watched their faces for disappointment or fear, but saw only acceptance. These children had learned not to expect control over their circumstances, a lesson no child should have to master. "We can help," Ivy offered immediately. "We know how to do lots of things." "I'm sure you do," Joss replied. "But first, let's get some food in you." Breakfast was a simple affair, bacon, eggs, and biscuits that were only slightly burned. Joss watched anxiously as the girls took their first bites, worried that his cooking would disappoint them. But their appreciation was genuine and touching, as if a hot meal shared at a table was a luxury they hadn't experienced in some time. "This is really good," Rose said, around a mouthful of biscuit. "You're a good cooker, Joss." "Cook," Ivy corrected automatically. "He's a good cook." Joss found himself charmed by their interaction, Ivy's protective correction, and Rose's enthusiastic but imprecise language. Watching them, he began to see their individual personalities more clearly. Ivy was the guardian, always alert to potential problems, always ready to shield her sister from harm. Rose was the dreamer, quick to trust and eager to find joy in small pleasures. After breakfast, Joss faced the practical challenges of entertaining 2 energetic children in a house designed for solitary living. The storm continued outside, making outdoor activities impossible, and his home contained no books suitable for children, no games, no toys, nothing that might occupy young minds. "What do you girls usually do during the day?" he asked. "Mama Ruth made us stay quiet," Ivy replied carefully. "She said children should be seen and not heard." "She didn't like it when we played too much," Rose added. "Said it gave her headaches." Joss felt another surge of anger toward the woman who had abandoned these children. What kind of person viewed children's natural exuberance as an affliction to be suppressed? He made a silent vow that in his care, these girls would be allowed to be children, to play, to laugh, to make the kind of noise that meant they felt safe and happy. "Well," Joss said thoughtfully, "I don't get headaches from children being children. In fact, I think this house has been too quiet for too long." The transformation in both girls was immediate and remarkable. Shoulders that had been held defensively began to relax, and their eyes brightened with something Joss realized was hope. Looking around his sparse main room, Joss tried to imagine it from a child's perspective. The furniture was all practical and adult-sized, offering no comfort for small bodies. The floors were bare wood, clean but hard and unwelcoming. There were no soft spaces, no colors, no signs that anyone lived here who cared about comfort or beauty. "You know what this place needs?" Joe said, surprising himself with the thought as he spoke it. "It needs some life in it." He went to his workbench in the corner and retrieved a piece of soft pine he'd been saving for no particular purpose. With his whittling knife, he began shaping it, his hands working from memory of skills he'd developed as a young man, but rarely used anymore. The girls watched with fascination as the wood slowly took shape under Joss's careful knife work. He hadn't planned what he was making when he started, but as the form emerged, he realized he was carving a small horse, not fancy, but recognizable and smooth enough for small hands to hold safely. "Is that for us?" Rose asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Well," Joss said, concentrating on the final details, "I suppose every ranch ought to have horses, even if they're just wooden ones." When he finished, he handed the carving to Rose, whose face lit up as if he'd given her precious jewels. She turned it over in her small hands, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I never had a horse before." "Every girl should have a horse," Joss said solemnly, "even if it's just a wooden one to start with." Ivy watched her sister's joy with a mixture of happiness and wariness, still not entirely trusting this unexpected kindness. But when Joss immediately began work on a second horse, her defenses softened visibly. As the morning progressed, Joss found himself drawn into the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful for these children. The second horse emerged from the wood with more confidence, his hands remembering skills he thought he'd forgotten. When he presented it to Ivy, her carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the 6-year-old child beneath the protective facade. "Thank you," she said quietly, cradling the wooden horse against her chest. "No one ever made us anything before." The words hit Joss with unexpected force. These children had lived their short lives without handmade gifts, without the kind of thoughtful attention that every child deserved. In their world, adults were obstacles to be managed or avoided, not sources of comfort and joy. For the first time since Mary's death, Joss found himself thinking about tomorrow not with dread or resigned acceptance, but with something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. These children needed so much, not just food and shelter, but the thousand small kindnesses that helped a child feel valued and loved. As the snow continued to fall outside, sealing them into this temporary family unit, Joss began to understand that the storm wasn't just preventing him from taking the girls to town. It was giving him time to discover whether he remembered how to be the kind of man who could offer those kindnesses, whether his heart had any warmth left to give. By the third morning, the storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a landscape transformed by pristine snow. The world outside Joss's windows looked clean and new, as if nature itself had decided to offer a fresh start. But despite the clear skies, Joss found himself reluctant to harness Duchess for the journey to town. He told himself it was practical caution. The roads would be treacherous, and taking 2 small children on such a journey would be risky. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't ready to let them go. Over the past 2 days, Ivy and Rose had begun to transform not just his daily routine, but the very atmosphere of his home. The girls had adapted to ranch life with remarkable speed. Rose had discovered the joy of watching cattle through the window, making up elaborate stories about their personalities and adventures. Ivy had appointed herself Joss's assistant, following him around as he performed his daily chores and asking questions about everything from weather patterns to the proper way to mend a fence. "Joss," Rose called from her perch by the window. "The brown cow with the white spot is looking sad today. Do you think she misses her family?" Joss paused in his task of checking their food supplies, a task that had become much more complex with 2 growing children to feed. "What makes you think she's sad?" he asked, genuinely curious about Rose's reasoning. "Her ears are droopy, and she keeps looking toward the mountains like she's waiting for someone to come home." Joss joined Rose at the window and followed her gaze to the cow in question, a 3-year-old heifer he'd never particularly noticed before. You know, he said thoughtfully, I think you might be right. Her name is Bessie, and she did have a calf last spring that I sold to a rancher up north. Rose's face grew solemn. So she's missing her baby. That's very sad. Sometimes that's how life works, Joss said gently. But Bessie's got the whole herd to keep her company, and she knows her calf is safe and growing strong somewhere else. Like how we had to leave our real mama, but now we have you to take care of us. The innocent question hit Joss squarely in the chest. Rose had drawn a parallel he hadn't expected, and her matter-of-fact acceptance that he was now their caretaker both warmed and terrified him. When had these children begun to think of him as a permanent fixture in their lives, rather than a temporary solution? Something like that, Joss managed to say. His voice rougher than usual. Ivy looked up from the book she'd been studying, one of Joss's practical manuals on cattle breeding that she'd chosen despite its obvious difficulty. Joss, what's this word? She asked, pointing to a line on the page. Joss leaned over to look. Gestation, he said. It means how long it takes for a baby animal to grow inside its mother before it's born. Like how long we grew inside our real mama. Exactly like that. Ivy nodded seriously and returned to her reading, as if understanding cattle reproduction was essential knowledge for her new life. Joss marveled at her determination to master adult concepts, her drive to prove herself worthy of the care she was receiving. As the day progressed, Joss found himself making small adjustments to accommodate his guests. He moved breakable items to higher shelves, placed cushions on chairs so the girls could reach the table more comfortably, and found himself checking on them more frequently than he checked on his cattle. The most significant change, however, was in the evening routine. For 5 years, Joss had spent his evenings in solitary activities, reading, maintaining equipment, or simply sitting on the porch, smoking his pipe and watching the sunset. Now, as darkness fell, both girls naturally gravitated toward the fireplace, where they sat on the floor, playing with their wooden horses and chatting quietly. Joss, Ivy said, as he settled into his rocking chair with a cup of coffee. Mama Ruth used to tell us stories sometimes. Not very good ones, but stories. What kind of stories? Joss asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Scary ones, Rose said with a shudder. About children who didn't behave and what happened to them. Joss felt his jaw tighten. Using fear to control children struck him as not just cruel, but counterproductive. How could a child learn to trust the world if they were constantly threatened with dire consequences for normal behavior? Well, Joss said carefully, I know some different kinds of stories. Stories about brave cowboys and smart horses, about children who go on adventures and always find their way home safely. Both girls looked up with immediate interest. Real stories? Rose asked. Some real, some made up, Joss admitted. Would you like to hear one? The enthusiasm of their response surprised him. They abandoned their wooden horses immediately and moved closer to his chair, settling cross-legged on the floor like eager pupils awaiting wisdom from their teacher. Joss searched his memory for appropriate stories. It had been decades since he'd told tales to children, but slowly the words began to come. He found himself recounting adventures from his own youth, cattle drives he'd been part of, storms he'd weathered, wildlife encounters that had seemed terrifying at the time, but made for exciting stories in retrospect. As he spoke, Joss watched the girls' faces transform. Fear and wariness melted away, replaced by wonder and engagement. They asked questions, gasped at exciting moments, and laughed at his descriptions of particularly stubborn cattle or cantankerous horses. Tell us another one, Rose begged when the first story ended. Please, Ivy added, her usual caution forgotten in the pleasure of the moment. Joss obliged, finding that storytelling came more naturally than he'd expected. The second tale was about a young cowboy, not unlike himself at that age, who had to rescue a lost calf during a blizzard. He embellished the details for dramatic effect, describing the howling wind and the hero's determination to save the frightened animal. By the time the story ended, both girls were yawning, despite their obvious desire to hear more. Joss felt a strange sense of accomplishment, as if he'd successfully completed a task he hadn't known he was capable of performing. "Time for bed," he said gently. "Tomorrow I'll tell you about the time I had to outsmart a family of bears who were trying to steal my supplies." Bears? Rose's eyes widened with delicious fear and anticipation. 3 of them, Joss confirmed solemnly. A mama, a papa, and a baby bear who was smarter than both his parents put together. As the girls prepared for bed, Joss realized that something fundamental had shifted in his thinking. He was no longer planning to take them to town tomorrow. He was planning tomorrow's story. He was thinking about what supplies they would need, what chores they could help with, how to make his home more suitable for children. The mended dress, hanging on a peg by the door, served as a tangible reminder of this change. That morning, he had noticed a tear in Rose's only spare dress, and had spent an hour carefully stitching it back together. The repair wasn't perfect. His hands were more accustomed to mending leather than delicate fabric, but it was done with care and attention to the child who would wear it. When the girls finally settled in the bedroom, their whispered conversation drifted through the thin walls. Just couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was different from their first night. Less fearful, more hopeful. They were beginning to believe they might be safe here. As Joss banked the fire and prepared his own makeshift bed by the hearth, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 3 days. The house felt different, warmer somehow, more alive. There was laughter during meals, questions throughout the day, and stories by the fire in the evening. For the first time since Mary's death, Joss found himself reluctant to see a day end, knowing that tomorrow would bring new small pleasures and discoveries. The girls were teaching him to notice details he'd forgotten were worth seeing. The way morning light made patterns on the floor, the satisfaction of a well-told story, the simple joy of sharing a meal with people who appreciated both the food and the company. As he settled into his blankets, Joss made a conscious decision to stop pretending this arrangement was temporary. These children had become part of his life, and he was beginning to understand that he didn't want to give them up. Tomorrow, instead of planning a trip to town, he would begin planning for a future that included all 3 of them. The first trip to town with Ivy and Rose was an event Joss had been dreading for over a week. He had run out of reasonable excuses to postpone it. Their food supplies were genuinely low. Winter was approaching in earnest, and the girls needed proper clothing for the cold months ahead. But he knew that taking them into Millbrook would invite questions, speculation, and possibly unwanted interference in their newly formed family. Joss spent the morning before their departure teaching the girls how to sit properly in the wagon, emphasizing the importance of staying close to him and not wandering off. Both children listened with the serious attention they gave all his instructions, but he could see excitement bubbling beneath their careful composure. "Will there be lots of people?" Rose asked as Joss hitched Duchess to the wagon. "Some," Joss replied. "It's not a very big town, but there will be folks we haven't met before. Will they be nice like you?" She pressed. Joss paused in adjusting the harness, considering how to answer honestly without frightening her. "Most people are good," he said finally, "but they might ask questions about you girls, about where you came from and why you're with me." Ivy's protective instincts immediately activated. "What kind of questions?" "Nothing bad," Joss assured her quickly. "They'll just be curious. People in small towns like to know about their neighbors. If anyone asks, just tell them you're staying with me and I'm taking care of you." That's the truth. The ride to Millbrook took just over an hour, following a winding trail that cut through valleys and around rocky outcroppings. The girls marveled at landmarks Joss had long taken for granted. A creek that bubbled over smooth stones, a grove of aspens that had turned brilliant gold, a hawk circling high overhead in search of prey. "Everything's so big out here," Rose observed, and craning her neck to see the mountains in the distance. "That's Wyoming for you," Joss said. "Lots of space between things." "I like it," Ivy declared. "You can see everything coming from a long way off." Joss understood what she meant. After a childhood where danger could appear without warning, the open landscape offered a sense of security. Here, threats would be visible long before they arrived. Giving plenty of time to prepare or escape, Millbrook appeared gradually as they crested a final hill, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street, with houses scattered on the surrounding slopes. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and Joz could see people moving about their daily business. The town looked peaceful and prosperous, but he still felt his shoulders tense as they approached. Their first stop was Brennan's General Store, no relation to Joss, despite the shared name. Henry Brennan was a portly, cheerful man who had run the store for 15 years and knew every resident of the territory by name, occupation, and personal history. As Joss helped the girls down from the wagon, he could see Henry watching through the store window with undisguised curiosity. "Good morning, Joss," Henry called as they entered, his eyes immediately shifting to Ivy and Rose. "And who might these young ladies be?" "Ivy and Rose," Joss replied simply. "They're staying with me." Henry's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Joss Brennan, the territory's most confirmed bachelor, traveling with two small girls, was news that would spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire. "Staying with you? Well, I'll be. Are they relatives?" "Not exactly," Joss said, steering the conversation toward safer ground. "I need supplies for winter, flour, sugar, coffee, and whatever you have in the way of children's clothing." Henry's attention was momentarily diverted by the business opportunity. "Children's clothing, eh? Well, let's see what Martha's got in the back. Martha!" He called to his wife, who emerged from the storeroom with obvious curiosity. Martha Brennan was a motherly woman who had raised 4 children of her own and possessed the kind of warm, practical manner that put children immediately at ease. She took one look at Ivy and Rose, and her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "My goodness," she said, kneeling to the girl's eye level. "Aren't you two pretty as pictures? What beautiful hair you have." Both girls instinctively moved closer to Joz, but they managed shy smiles in response to Martha's genuine warmth. "They need winter clothes," Joss explained. "Dresses, undergarments, coats, boots, everything a child would need for the cold months." Martha's experienced eye quickly assessed the girl's current clothing, clean but worn. Obviously hand-me-downs that had seen better days. "Of course they do," she said briskly. "Come along, girls. Let's see what we can find that fits properly." As Martha led Ivy and Rose toward the clothing section, Joss could hear her chatting with them in the easy manner of a woman accustomed to children. "Now then, what are your favorite colors? Do you prefer practical things or pretty things? Have you ever had a proper winter coat before?" Henry, meanwhile, was studying Joss with the calculating look of a man trying to solve a puzzle. "Joss," he said quietly, "I don't mean to pry, but those girls look like they've been through some hardship. Are they in some kind of trouble?" Joss chose his words carefully. "They were abandoned," he said. "I found them and took them in. They're good children and they're safe now." "Abandoned?" Henry's voice carried a mixture of shock and sympathy. "What kind of person abandons children?" "The kind who shouldn't have had them in the first place," Joss replied grimly. Henry nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you're doing the good thing, Joss. Those girls are lucky to have found you." He paused, then added more quietly, "Though folks are gonna talk, you know. A bachelor taking in 2 children, there'll be questions about whether it's proper." Joss felt his jaw tighten. "Let them talk. Those girls need care, and I'm providing it. That's all that matters." "Oh, I agree completely," Henry said hastily. "I'm just giving you fair warning. You might want to think about making the arrangement official somehow. Talk to Judge Morrison when he makes his circuit through town. Legal guardianship would put some of the gossip to rest." From the clothing section came the sound of Rose's delighted laughter as Martha showed her a small blue dress with white buttons. Joss felt his heart constrict with an emotion he couldn't quite name, pride, perhaps, or protective love. These children deserved to experience joy in simple pleasures like new clothes and kind attention. "Joss," Ivy called, holding up a practical brown dress for his approval. "Martha says this one will wear well and won't show dirt too much." "It's perfect," Joss said, though he privately thought the brown was too dull for such a vibrant child. "What about Rose?" "I like the blue one," Rose announced, spinning to make the skirt flare out. "It makes me feel like dancing." Martha caught Joss's eye and smiled. The blue suits her coloring beautifully, and I've found warm coats for both of them, plus boots that should last through the winter. As they completed their shopping, Joz became aware of the attention they were attracting. Other customers entered the store and lingered longer than necessary, stealing glances at the unusual family group. He could practically feel the speculation building around them. Mrs. Adelaide Winters, the town's most dedicated gossip, made a point of examining fabric near where the girls were trying on coats. "Such pretty children," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Are they visiting family in the area?" "They're with me," Joss said firmly, offering no additional information. "How nice," Mrs. Winters replied, with false sweetness. "It's wonderful to see children bringing such joy to someone who's been alone so long." The implication in her tone was unmistakable. She was fishing for details she could share with her network of friends. Joss recognized the type of woman who thrived on other people's business and made it her mission to uncover every secret in town. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Joss noticed several people watching from doorways and windows. The girls seemed oblivious to the attention, chattering excitedly about their new clothes and the various interesting sights they had observed in town. "Joss," Rose said as they prepared to leave, "when can we come back? I liked the lady with the pretty dresses." "Martha is very kind," Joss agreed. "We'll come back when we need supplies." The ride home was filled with the girls' observations about their first real town experience. They had been impressed by the number of buildings, fascinated by the variety of goods in the store, and charmed by Martha's motherly attention. Their excitement was infectious, and Joss found himself smiling at their enthusiasm, but beneath his pleasure in their happiness, Jod was troubled by Henry's warning about gossip and the need for legal guardianship. He had been so focused on the immediate needs of caring for Ivy and Rose that he hadn't considered the broader implications of their situation. As his ranch house came into view, Joss made a decision. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of making his guardianship of the girls official. They deserved the security of knowing their place in his life was legally protected, and he deserved the right to defend them against any future challenges to their arrangement. The hand-knitted mittens he had awkwardly created the night before lay on the kitchen table, imperfect but made with care, a tangible symbol of his commitment to their future together. Like his clumsy stitches, his parenting might not be perfect, but it was done with love and the determination to give these children the security they had never known. Winter arrived in earnest 2 weeks after their trip to town, blanketing the ranch in snow that would last until spring. The isolation that had once been Joss's refuge now became the cocoon in which their unconventional family could grow and strengthen without outside interference. The days settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing: morning chores, afternoon lessons, and evening stories by the fire. Joss had discovered that both girls possessed quick minds, hungry for knowledge. Ivy attacked learning with the same protective determination she brought to caring for her sister, while Rose approached it with joyful curiosity that transformed even basic arithmetic into an adventure. Neither had received formal schooling, but their natural intelligence shone through their eagerness to understand the world around them. The family Bible had become an unexpected teaching tool. Joss hadn't opened it since Mary's funeral, but one evening, when the girls asked about letters and words, he had pulled it down from the shelf almost without thinking. The familiar weight of the leather-bound book brought back memories of his own childhood, when his mother had taught him to read using the same volume. "This was my mother's Bible," Joss explained as he opened it carefully. "She taught me to read from these pages, just like I'm teaching you." "What happened to your mother?" Rose asked with the directness that only children possessed. Joss paused, considering his answer. "She died when I was about 15. A fever took her one winter, along with my father." "So you were alone like us," Ivy observed quietly. "Yes," Joss said. "I suppose I was. But now we're not alone anymore," Rose added with the simple logic that made complicated truths seem obvious. "We have each other." The words hit Joss with unexpected force. In caring for these girls, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was missing, the sense of being needed, of having a purpose beyond mere survival. They had healed a wound in his heart that he had thought was permanent. As the weeks passed, Joss watched the girls blossom in ways that constantly amazed him. Ivy's protective shell began to crack, revealing glimpses of the playful child beneath her serious exterior. Rose's natural exuberance, no longer suppressed by Ruth's harsh discipline, filled the house with laughter and wonder. Their nightly storytelling sessions had evolved into collaborative efforts, with the girls adding details and suggesting plot twists that often improved Joss's narratives. Rose had a particular talent for describing the feelings of characters, while Ivy excelled at predicting logical consequences of actions. "Tell us the one about the lost horse again," Rose requested one snowy evening, settling into her favorite spot on the floor beside Joss's chair. "You've heard that story a dozen times," Joss protested mildly, "but it's different every time you tell it," Ivy pointed out. "Last time the horse found its way home by following the North Star. The time before that it followed a friendly wolf." Joss smiled, realizing she was right. The stories had become living things, growing and changing with each telling. Like his relationship with the girls themselves, they evolved based on the needs of the moment and the mood of the evening. "All right," he said, settling back in his chair. "But tonight, you two get to decide how the horse finds its way home." Their delighted faces made the extra effort worthwhile. This was what childhood should be, safe spaces where imagination could flourish, where questions were welcomed rather than discouraged, where love was demonstrated through attention and care rather than fear and control. The Bible had become more than just a reading primer. Joss found himself drawn to passages he hadn't considered in years, stories that took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of his transformed life. The tale of Ruth, ironically sharing a name with the woman who had abandoned his girls, spoke to him of loyalty and chosen family. The story of the Good Samaritan reminded him that sometimes love meant caring for strangers who became something more precious than blood relations. "Joss," Ivy said one evening as they finished reading about Moses being found in the bulrushes, "do you think God meant for you to find us?" The question caught him off guard. Joss had wrestled with faith since Mary's death, unable to reconcile a loving God with the crushing losses he had endured. But looking at these two children, healthy, happy, and thriving under his care, he felt something that might have been the stirring of renewed faith. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but I'm grateful it happened, however it came about." "I think he did," Rose said with the certainty that only children could muster, "because you needed us as much as we needed you." Out of the mouths of babes, Joss thought, feeling another crack appear in the walls he had built around his heart. These children saw truths that adults often missed, understood connections that logic couldn't explain. As winter deepened, Joss began to notice changes in himself that went beyond the practical adjustments of caring for children. He found himself humming while he worked, something he hadn't done since Mary's death. He looked forward to mealtimes, not just as necessary fuel, but as opportunities for conversation and shared laughter. Most significantly, he began to plan for the future again, imagining the girls as they grew older, thinking about what they would need to thrive in the world. But with these positive changes came moments of doubt that crept in during quiet hours. Was he truly capable of raising two children? Could a man who had withdrawn from the world for 5 years provide the guidance and stability they deserved? What would happen when they reached an age where they needed a woman's guidance, or when young men came calling? These fears usually struck him late at night, when the girls were asleep and the house fell into the kind of silence that invited troubling thoughts. Joss would lie on his makeshift bed by the fire, listening to their peaceful breathing from the bedroom, and wonder if his love for them was enough to overcome his limitations as a father figure. One particularly difficult night, when his doubts seemed overwhelming, Joss quietly retrieved his leather journal from beneath his old bed. For the first time since Mary's death, he opened it to a blank page and began to write, December 15th, 1873. Ivy made me laugh today by trying to teach the cattle their names. She's convinced they're just being stubborn when they don't respond. Rose spent an hour drawing pictures of our horses, the real ones and the wooden ones I carved. She says the wooden ones are happy because they get to live in the warm house instead of the cold barn. I never expected to be writing in this book again, never expected to have anything worth recording. But these girls have given me reason to document our days, to preserve the small moments that might otherwise be forgotten. They've taught me that love doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes it's two frightened children teaching a broken man how to hope again. Writing those words felt like a prayer, an acknowledgement of the miracle that had transformed his life. Just closed the journal and returned it to its hiding place, but the act of recording his gratitude had settled something in his heart. The next morning brought fresh snow and the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the world look newly made. As Joyce prepared breakfast, he could hear the girls whispering in the bedroom, planning some surprise that would undoubtedly involve more laughter and joy than his old house had seen in years. Watching them emerge, hair tousled from sleep, faces bright with excitement about the new day, Joss felt his doubts recede. He might not be perfect, but he was present. He might not have all the answers, but he was learning alongside them. Most importantly, he was here and they were safe. And together they were building something that felt very much like family. The family Bible sat open on the table, bookmarked at the passage they had read the night before. George glanced at the familiar words and smiled, understanding for the first time in years that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting that love was strong enough to find a way forward, one day at a time. The knock on the door came on a February morning when the wind was howling across the prairie like a living thing. And Giles was teaching the girls basic arithmetic at the kitchen table, using dried beans to help them visualize addition and subtraction, when the sharp rap of knuckles against wood froze all three of them in place. Visitors were rare at the best of times, and in the depths of winter, anyone traveling to his remote ranch had to have urgent business indeed. Bruce felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as he rose from the table. "Stay here," he told the girls quietly, noting how Ivy immediately moved closer to Rose, her protective instincts activated by his tone. Through the frost-covered window, Jaws could make out two figures on horseback, a man in an official-looking coat and a woman wrapped in expensive furs. Neither looked like they belonged in the Wyoming territory, and Joss's unease deepened as he recognized the bearing of people accustomed to authority and getting their way. He opened the door to find a thin, severe-looking man with a badge pinned to his coat and papers clutched in his gloved hand. Beside him sat a woman whose pinched features and calculating eyes reminded Joss unpleasantly of a bird of prey sizing up potential victims. "Are you Josiah Brennan?" the man asked without preamble. "I am. I'm Deputy Marshal Crawford from Cheyenne, and this is Mrs. Victoria Blackwood from the Territorial Children's Aid Society. We're here about two minor children believed to be in your care." Joss felt the bottom drop out of his world. "What about them? May we come in? This is official business that requires discussion." Every instinct in Joss's body screamed at him to refuse, to slam the door and bar it against these unwelcome intruders. But he knew that would only make matters worse. With great reluctance, he stepped aside to allow them entry. The warmth of the house seemed to evaporate the moment the strangers crossed the threshold. Joss could see Ivy and Rose at the kitchen table, their faces pale with fear as they recognized the potential threat these adults represented. Mrs. Blackwood's sharp gaze swept the room, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of someone trained to find fault. Her attention lingered on the girls' makeshift school setup, the wooden horses on the mantelpiece, and the family Bible open on the side table. "So these are the Caldwell twins," she said, her voice carrying a tone that suggested she was viewing specimens rather than children. "Their names are Ivy and Rose," Joss said firmly. "And yes, they're staying with me." Deputy Crawford consulted his papers. According to our information, these children were abandoned by their legal guardian, one Ruth Caldwell, approximately 3 months ago. You found them and took them in without reporting the situation to proper authorities. I took in 2 frightened children who needed help, Joss replied, fighting to keep his voice level. They were alone and scared, and winter was coming. I did what any decent person would do. What any decent person would do, Mrs. Blackwood said with barely concealed disdain, is immediately contact the appropriate agencies trained to handle such situations. Instead, you kept these children in your home without legal authority, without proper supervision, and without regard for their welfare. Joss felt anger flare in his chest. Without regard for their welfare. Look at them. Do they look neglected to you? The girls did indeed look healthy and well cared for. Their faces had filled out from the hollow-cheeked waifs he had found in November. Their clothes were clean and well-fitted, their hair neatly braided, their eyes bright with intelligence and curiosity. But Mrs. Blackwood seemed determined to find problems where none existed. The issue, Mr. Brennan, she continued coldly, is not their physical condition, but the impropriety of their situation. An unmarried man, living alone, with no female supervision. It's entirely inappropriate for young girls to be placed in such circumstances. I've provided them with love, safety, education, and stability, Joss said through gritted teeth. What more do they need? They need proper placement with a suitable family, Deputy Crawford interjected, pulling out an official-looking document. I have here a court order authorizing the removal of Ivy and Rose Caldwell to the custody of the Territorial Children's Aid Society, pending placement in an appropriate home. The words hit Joss like physical blows. He could hear Rose beginning to cry softly, and Ivy's fierce whisper telling her sister to be brave. The sound of their distress cut through him like a knife. This is their home, Joss said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. They're happy here. They're safe here. They're learning and growing. They're living in an irregular situation that could be harmful to their moral development, Mrs. Blackwood interrupted. The society has identified a suitable family in Denver, the Weatherbys, a respectable married couple who have expressed interest in adopting twin girls. The Weatherbys don't know them, Joss protested. They don't know that Ivy has nightmares about being abandoned again, or that Rose loves to make up stories about the cattle, or that they both need to feel safe before they can trust. You want to tear them away from the only security they've known and hand them over to strangers. We want to place them with a proper family, Mrs. Blackwood said with infuriating calm. A married couple who can provide appropriate male and female role models, religious instruction, and social connections suitable for young ladies. Joss looked at the legal document Crawford was holding, seeing his worst nightmare made manifest in official language and government seals. How did you even find us? He asked. Crawford consulted his notes. We received a report from a concerned citizen in Millbrook about an unusual living arrangement. Upon investigation, we discovered that you had indeed taken in these children without proper legal channels. Joss's mind immediately went to Mrs. Adelaide Winters and her persistent questions during their shopping trip. The busybody had made good on her implied threat to investigate their situation, probably believing she was performing some kind of civic duty. The children will need to be ready to travel within the hour, Mrs. Blackwood announced, as if the matter was already settled. We have a long journey ahead of us, and the weather may worsen. No. The word came out of Joss's mouth with such force that both officials took a step back. You're not taking them anywhere. Mr. Brennan, Deputy Crawford said, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. You need to understand that this is a legal order. Interfering with its execution would be a serious crime. Joss looked at Ivy and Rose, seeing terror in their eyes that reminded him painfully of the day he had first found them. All the security and happiness they had built together over the past months was about to be destroyed by strangers who cared nothing for their individual needs or wishes. What would it take? Joss asked desperately. What would I need to do to keep them legally? Mrs. Blackwood's smile was cold and triumphant. You would need to be married, Mr. Brennan. The territory requires that orphaned children be placed with married couples who can provide proper supervision and moral guidance. As a bachelor, you simply don't qualify as a suitable guardian. Then I'll get married, Joss said without hesitation. The officials exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this response. Marriage isn't something one arranges on short notice, Mr. Brennan, Crawford said. These children need immediate placement, not promises of future suitability. Give me 2 weeks, Joss pleaded. 2 weeks to arrange a marriage and file the proper paperwork. Surely the children's welfare is better served by allowing them to remain in a home where they're loved and cared for rather than forcing them into an uncertain situation with strangers. Mrs. Blackwood's expression suggested she found the entire situation distasteful. Even if such an arrangement were possible, there would still be the question of finding a suitable bride willing to take on such responsibilities. And the marriage would need to be properly documented and legally recognized. "I understand the requirements," Joss said, his mind racing through possibilities he had never imagined considering. "I just need time to meet them." The two officials conferred in whispered conversation while Joss watched his girls cling to each other at the kitchen table. Finally, Crawford turned back to him. "We can allow 1 week," he said grudgingly. 7 days to produce a legal marriage certificate and file appropriate guardianship papers. If you fail to meet these requirements, we will return to collect the children, and any further interference will result in criminal charges. Mrs. Blackwood looked thoroughly displeased with this compromise. "I want to be clear, Mr. Brennan, that this is highly irregular. The society strongly believes these children would be better served by immediate placement with the Denver family. The children will stay with me," Joss said firmly, the legal document in Crawford's hand representing both a reprieve and an ultimatum. After the officials departed, leaving behind only the memory of their cold authority and the scent of Mrs. Blackwood's expensive perfume, Joss sat heavily at the kitchen table. Ivy and Rose immediately rushed to him, throwing their arms around his neck in desperate relief. "Are they going to take us away?" Rose asked through her tears. "Not if I can help it," Joss promised, though he had no idea how he could possibly fulfill the requirements they had set. A week to find a wife willing to marry a virtual stranger and take on 2 traumatized children. It seemed an impossible task. "What are we going to do?" Ivy asked, her young face showing a maturity no child should possess. Joss looked at the legal document lying on his table, its official seals and formal language representing the power of institutions to destroy families in the name of propriety. Then he looked at his girls, frightened but trusting, vulnerable but brave, depending on him to find a solution to an impossible problem. "We're going to fight," he said quietly. "We're going to find a way to stay together, no matter what it takes." The signed deed to his ranch lay in the strongbox under his bed, representing everything he owned in the world. Judd realized he would risk it all, his property, his freedom, his very future, rather than let these children be taken from the only home where they had ever felt truly safe and loved. The question was whether love would be enough to overcome the cold machinery of law and social convention that threatened to tear their family apart. The first day after the official's visit passed in a haze of desperate planning. Joss barely slept, pacing the floor by the dying fire while Ivy and Rose huddled together in the bedroom, their whispered conversations filled with fear and confusion. By dawn, he had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. He would humble himself before the entire territory, if necessary, to find a woman willing to enter into a marriage of convenience to save his girls. The problem was that Joss knew precious few unmarried women, and fewer still who might consider such an arrangement. His years of self-imposed isolation had left him with virtually no social connections beyond basic business relationships. The task ahead seemed insurmountable, but the alternative, watching Ivy and Rose disappear into an uncertain future with strangers, was unthinkable. "Joss," Ivy said quietly as he prepared breakfast with unsteady hands, "you don't have to do this for us." He turned to find both girls watching him with expressions far too solemn for children their age. The weight of adult concerns had settled on their small shoulders, and Joss felt a surge of anger at the officials who had placed this burden on them. "Yes, I do," he said gently but firmly. "You're my family now, and families protect each other. But getting married is supposed to be special," Rose added, her voice trembling. "You're supposed to love the lady and want to be with her forever." Joss knelt down to their level, taking their small hands in his weathered ones. "Sometimes love comes first, and sometimes it comes later," he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he felt. "The important thing is that we'll still be together, and that's what matters most." After breakfast, Joss hitched up the wagon with grim determination. His first stop would be Henry Brennan at the general store. The man knew everyone in the territory and might have suggestions for Joss's impossible quest. The girls wanted to come along, but Joss insisted they stay at the ranch. He couldn't bear the thought of them witnessing his potential humiliation as he essentially begged women to consider marrying him. The ride to Millbrook seemed longer than usual, each mile stretching endlessly as Joss rehearsed various approaches to his unprecedented request. How did one ask virtual strangers to consider a marriage of convenience? What woman in her right mind would want to take on such a complicated situation? Henry's reaction to Joss's explanation was a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. "Good Lord, Joss," he said, shaking his head. "I knew that Winter's woman was trouble, but I never thought she'd go this far. Calling in the territorial authorities over a man caring for orphaned children, it's beyond cruel." "I don't have time to worry about Mrs. Winters," Joss said tersely. "I need to find a wife, and I need to find one fast. Do you know any unmarried women who might consider such an arrangement?" Henry stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Well, there's Sarah Fleming. She's been widowed for 2 years now, has 3 children of her own. But her farm's doing well, and I can't see her wanting to take on 2 more mouths to feed. What about younger women? Spinsters who might want a home and family? There's Mabel Carson, but she's barely 18 and probably has her heart set on romance rather than practicality. Emma Holbrook is 25 and unmarried, but she's taking care of her ailing mother and couldn't leave town." Each name Henry mentioned seemed to come with insurmountable obstacles. Joss felt his hope dwindling as the morning progressed, but he forced himself to continue the search. He visited the church, where Reverend Mitchell listened sympathetically but could offer no immediate solutions. He stopped at the schoolhouse, where the young teacher was already engaged to a banker from Cheyenne. By afternoon, Joss had spoken with every woman in Millbrook who might remotely qualify as a potential bride, and the results were uniformly discouraging. Those who were available lacked the desire for such a complicated arrangement, while those who might have been interested were unavailable due to other commitments. As the sun began to set, Joss found himself sitting in the saloon, a place he rarely frequented, nursing a whiskey and contemplating defeat. The bartender, a grizzled man named Murphy, who had seen every kind of human drama play out in his establishment, noticed Joss's dejected expression. "You look like a man with troubles, Brennan," Murphy observed. "Polishing a glass with practiced efficiency. More troubles than I know how to handle," Joss admitted, then found himself explaining the situation to the sympathetic bartender. Murphy listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When Joss finished his story, the older man was quiet for a long moment. "You know," Murphy said finally, "there might be someone. Elena Martinez. She runs the boarding house over on 2nd Street. Came here from New Mexico after her husband died. Been struggling to make ends meet ever since. She's got experience with children, keeps a clean house, and from what I've heard, she's got a good heart." Joss felt a flicker of hope. "Why hasn't anyone mentioned her before?" "Well," Murphy said carefully, "some folks around here aren't too welcoming to Mexican women, if you catch my meaning. But if you're looking for someone who understands hard times and knows how to care for children, she might be worth talking to." The boarding house was a modest 2-story building that showed signs of careful maintenance despite its obvious age. Jos stood on the front porch for several minutes, gathering his courage before knocking. The door was answered by a woman in her early 30s, with kind eyes and prematurely silver-streaked hair. "Senora Martinez?" Jos asked, removing his hat. "See, yes. How can I help you?" Jos took a deep breath and launched into his explanation, watching Elena's expression change from confusion to understanding to something that might have been sympathy. She listened without interruption, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to read his character. When he finished speaking, Elena was quiet for a long moment. "This is very unusual, Signor Brennan," she said finally, her English careful but clear. "You ask me to marry a man I do not know, to become mother to children I have never met." "I know it sounds crazy," Jos admitted, "but those girls need a stable home, and I need a wife to provide it legally. I'm not asking for love or romance, just partnership, mutual respect, and help caring for 2 children who have already lost too much." Elena studied him for another long moment. "Tell me about these niñas," she said. "What are they like?" Jos found himself describing Ivy and Rose with a warmth that surprised even him. He spoke of Ivy's protective nature and Rose's boundless curiosity, of their eagerness to learn and their courage in the face of abandonment. As he talked, Elena's expression softened noticeably. "They sound like good children," she said when he finished. "Children who deserve a chance at happiness. They are good children," Jos confirmed. "The best I've ever known." Elena glanced back into her boarding house, where Jos could see the sparse furnishings and worn carpets that spoke of financial struggle. "I must think about this, Signor Brennan. It is not a decision to make quickly. I understand," Jos said, though inside he was screaming that there was no time for lengthy consideration. "But I need an answer soon. We only have 6 days left." "Come back tomorrow evening," Elena said. "I will have an answer for you then." The ride home was torture. Jos alternated between hope and despair, imagining every possible outcome of Elena's deliberation. When he arrived at the ranch, the girls rushed to greet him with desperate eagerness. "Did you find someone?" Rose asked immediately. "Maybe," Jos said carefully. "There's a lady who's thinking about it." That night, Jos lay awake, staring at the ceiling and contemplating the magnitude of what he was asking. Elena Martinez would be giving up her independence, her boarding house business, and her familiar life to marry a stranger and help him raise 2 orphan children. It was an enormous sacrifice to ask of anyone, regardless of the practical benefits it might offer. But as he listened to the girls' peaceful breathing from the bedroom, Jos knew he would do anything, ask any favor, make any promise, pay any price to keep them safe and together. They had already suffered too much loss for children so young. He would not let bureaucratic propriety rob them of the security and love they had finally found. The next evening arrived with agonizing slowness. Jos spent the day trying to maintain normal routines for the girls' sake, but his distraction was obvious. They helped with chores in unusually subdued silence, their own anxiety mirroring his as the crucial meeting approached. Elena was waiting for him on her front porch when he arrived, a small suitcase at her feet and a determined expression on her face. "I have decided." "Signor Brennan," she said without preamble, "I will marry you." Jos felt his knees go weak with relief. "You will?" "See, but I have conditions. I will not be treated as a servant in my own home. I expect respect, fairness in all decisions regarding the children, and the right to bring my own traditions and beliefs into our household." "Of course," Jos agreed immediately. "Anything you want." "And," Elena continued, her voice growing softer, "if love should grow between us over time, we will not fight it. But if it does not, we will still treat each other with kindness and dignity." Jos nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. This woman was willing to risk everything on the chance that they could build something meaningful together, all for the sake of 2 children she had never met. "When do we do this?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," Elena replied practically. "Reverend Mitchell has agreed to perform a simple ceremony. We will need witnesses. I have asked Senora Brennan from the general store, and perhaps you could ask her husband." As they made final arrangements, Jos marveled at Elena's composure and practical approach to their unusual situation. She spoke of their impending marriage as she might discuss a business partnership, but he could see glimpses of nervousness in her careful movements and the way she smoothed her skirts repeatedly. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant sunshine that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. As Jos prepared for his wedding day, he thought about Mary and wondered what she would make of this strange turn his life had taken. He hoped she would understand that this marriage was born not of betrayal to her memory, but of love for two children who needed protection more than they needed conventional propriety. The signed deed to his ranch lay on the table beside him. Everything he owned, everything he was, about to be shared with a woman he barely knew, in the hope that together they could save the family that mattered more to him than his own life. The small church in Millbrook had never hosted a more unusual wedding ceremony. Jos stood at the altar in his best shirt and cleanest pants, his hands trembling slightly as he watched Elena Martinez walk down the aisle in a simple blue dress that matched the color of the Wyoming sky. Behind them, Henry and Martha Brennan served as witnesses to a union born of necessity but blessed with hope. Ivy and Rose sat in the front pew, their faces a mixture of wonder and anxiety. Jos had tried to explain the situation to them in terms they could understand, that Elena was going to become part of their family, that she would help take care of them and make sure they could all stay together. But he could see the questions in their eyes, the fear that this stranger might somehow change the bond they had built with him. Reverend Mitchell had agreed to perform the ceremony despite its unconventional nature. Moved by the story of two orphaned children who needed protection from bureaucratic interference, the elderly minister had known Jos since his first marriage to Mary and understood the depth of sacrifice this arrangement represented. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of solemnity the occasion deserved. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Josiah Brennan and Elena Martinez in holy matrimony." Jos tried to focus on the familiar words, but his mind kept wandering to the legal document folded in his jacket pocket, the marriage certificate that would transform him from an unsuitable bachelor into a respectable married man in the eyes of the law. Everything depended on this ceremony being legally binding and properly recorded before Deputy Crawford and Mrs. Blackwood returned. Elena stood beside him with quiet dignity, her dark eyes focused on the minister's words. Jos found himself studying her profile, noting the strength in her jawline and the intelligence in her expression. This woman was risking everything on the word of a stranger, trusting that he would honor his promise to treat her with respect and fairness. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Reverend Mitchell continued, "but with careful consideration and mutual commitment to the sacred vows being made." The irony of those words was not lost on Jos. Their marriage was being entered into with desperate haste, rather than careful consideration, born of legal necessity rather than romantic love. Yet as he looked at Elena's calm composure and thought of the children sitting behind them, he felt a deep sense of rightness about what they were doing. "Josiah," the minister said, turning to address him directly, "do you take Elena to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part." Jos met Elena's eyes and saw understanding there. They were both aware of the complexity of the promises they were making. "I do," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the small church. "Elena, do you take Josiah to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Elena's response was equally clear and confident. "I do. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Josiah, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was brief and respectful, more of a handshake than a romantic gesture, but it sealed their legal union in the eyes of both God and government. As they turned to face their small congregation, Joss felt a surge of gratitude toward this brave woman who had chosen to bind her fate to his. Martha Brennan was crying openly, moved by the unusual circumstances that had brought this couple together. Henry nodded approvingly, understanding the practical necessity that drove their decision. But it was the expressions on Ivy and Rose's faces that mattered most to Joss: relief, hope, and the beginning of acceptance that their family was about to expand. After the ceremony, the small group gathered at the general store to complete the legal paperwork. Elena signed her name with careful precision, officially becoming Mrs. Elena Brennan and gaining the legal standing necessary to help Joss maintain custody of the girls. The marriage certificate was filed with the territorial registry, creating an official record that would satisfy even the most stringent bureaucratic requirements. "Congratulations," Martha said warmly, embracing Elena with genuine affection. "Welcome to our community, dear. I hope you'll be very happy here." "Thank you," Elena replied, her English still careful but growing more confident. "I hope so too." Henry pulled Joss aside as the women talked. "You've done a good thing here, Joss," he said quietly. "Elena's a fine woman who's had her share of hardships. She'll be good for you and the girls, given half a chance." "I hope so," Joss said, watching as Elena knelt down to speak with Ivy and Rose, her voice gentle and reassuring despite the language barrier. As they prepared to leave for the ranch, Joss felt the weight of the courthouse gavel that would soon judge whether their hastily arranged marriage was sufficient to protect their family. In 3 days, Deputy Crawford and Mrs. Blackwood would return, expecting to find either a legally married couple with proper guardianship papers or 2 children ready for transport to Denver. The first hurdle had been cleared. They were now legally married. But Joss knew that the real test lay ahead, in proving to skeptical officials that their unconventional arrangement was genuinely in the children's best interests. Elena had agreed to marry him, but would she be able to convince hardened bureaucrats that she was a suitable mother for 2 traumatized orphans she had just met? As they climbed into the wagon for the journey home, Joss looked at his new wife and his daughters, understanding that their future together depended on the next 72 hours. The courtroom gavel would soon decide whether love and determination could triumph over rigid social conventions and bureaucratic indifference. 3 days after the wedding, Deputy Crawford and Mrs. Blackwood returned to the ranch with the same official bearing and cold authority they had displayed during their first visit. But this time they found a transformed household, Joss and Elena presenting a united front, with Ivy and Rose standing close to their new stepmother, displaying the kind of comfortable familiarity that couldn't be manufactured overnight. Elena had worked tirelessly during those 3 days to create evidence of a genuine family structure. She had rearranged the house to include feminine touches, prepared meals that showcased her domestic skills, and most importantly, had begun the delicate process of winning the girls' trust and affection. "Good morning," Joss said as he opened the door to the officials, his voice steady and confident. "I believe you'll find everything in order this time." Mrs. Blackwood's sharp eyes immediately took in the changes: curtains at the windows, a woman's cloak hanging by the door, and the unmistakable evidence of female presence throughout the home. Her expression suggested she was both surprised and annoyed by this development. "So you actually went through with it," Deputy Crawford said, consulting his papers. "You found someone willing to marry you under these circumstances." "I found someone willing to become part of our family," Joss corrected firmly. "Elena, I'd like you to meet Deputy Crawford and Mrs. Blackwood from the Children's Aid Society." Elena stepped forward with quiet dignity, wearing her late wife's wedding ring that Joss had given her the morning after their ceremony, not as a romantic gesture, but as a symbol of their commitment to making their arrangement work. "Good morning," she said politely, her accent soft, but her bearing confident. Mrs. Blackwood studied Elena with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential weakness. "Mrs. Brennan, I presume? Tell me about your qualifications for caring for these children." I have raised 3 children of my own, Lena replied calmly. My husband died in the war, and I supported my family by taking in boarders and caring for other people's children. I understand what niños need to feel safe and loved, and you were willing to marry a complete stranger just to provide a home for 2 orphans. Elena's chin lifted slightly, and Joss recognized the steel beneath her gentle exterior. I was willing to marry a good man who loves these children and give them the mother they deserve. Senor, Mr. Brennan has shown me nothing but respect, and Ivy and Rose are beautiful, intelligent girls who have already been through too much. As if summoned by her words, both girls moved closer to Eleanor, with Rose actually taking her stepmother's hand in a gesture of support that clearly surprised both officials. We like Eleanor, Rose announced with the directness that only children possessed. She makes tortillas and tells us stories in Spanish, and she doesn't get mad when we ask questions. Ivy nodded solemnly. She braided my hair this morning and showed me how to cook eggs the way her mama taught her. She's nice to us, and she's nice to Joss, too. Mrs. Blackwood's expression suggested she found these testimonials less than convincing. Children can be easily influenced by small kindnesses. The question is whether this arrangement provides genuine stability and moral guidance. Perhaps you'd like to see our guardianship papers, Joe said, producing the documents he and Elena had filed with the territorial court. Everything is properly legal now. We're a married couple seeking formal custody of the girls. Deputy Crawford examined the paperwork with professional thoroughness, while Mrs. Blackwood continued her inspection of the household. Joss watched nervously as she noted the family Bible open on the table, the girls' school books arranged neatly on a shelf, and the comfortable domestic atmosphere that Elena had worked so hard to create. The paperwork appears to be in order, Crawford admitted reluctantly. The marriage is legally recorded, and the guardianship petition follows proper procedure. That may be, Mrs. Blackwood said, clearly unwilling to concede defeat so easily, but I still have concerns about the hasty nature of this arrangement. How do we know this marriage is genuine and not simply a convenience to circumvent proper child placement procedures? Elena stepped forward, and Joss was amazed by the quiet authority in her voice. Senora Blackwood, you ask if our marriage is genuine. I will tell you what is genuine. The love these children have for their Papa Joss and the love he has for them. I see how he looks at them, how careful he is with their feelings, how he reads to them every night and makes sure they feel safe. She paused, gathering strength for her next words. I lost my own children to fever 3 years ago. When I see Ivy and Rose with Joss, I see what family should look like. Not perfect, maybe, but full of caring and respect. You want to take them from the only father they have ever truly known and give them to strangers in Denver. How is that better for them? The passion in Elena's voice seemed to catch Mrs. Blackwood off guard. For the first time since entering the house, the cold official looked uncertain. The Denver family comes highly recommended, she said. But her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Maybe so, Elena replied, but they are not here. They do not know that Ivy has bad dreams sometimes, or that Rose likes to count stars before she falls asleep. They do not know these things because they do not love these niñas yet. We do. Joss felt a surge of admiration for his new wife. In 3 days, she had not only learned to care for his girls, but had become their fierce protector, willing to stand up to official authority on their behalf. Deputy Crawford cleared his throat. The legal requirements have been met, he said finally. Mr. and Mrs. Brennan are now qualified guardians under territorial law. Mrs. Blackwood's expression suggested she had swallowed something bitter, but she had no grounds left to challenge their arrangement. The wedding ring on Elena's finger caught the light as she kept her arm protectively around Rose, a symbol of the commitment that had saved their family from dissolution. Very well, Mrs. Blackwood said through gritted teeth. But be aware that the society will be monitoring this situation. Any reports of improper care or unstable conditions will result in immediate intervention. As the officials prepared to leave, Joss realized they had won more than just a legal victory. They had become a real family, united in their determination to protect each other against any threat that might arise. 6 months later, the Wyoming Territory had experienced one of its mildest springs in memory, and the Brennan Ranch reflected the renewal that seemed to touch everything around them. Where once there had been only practical functionality, now there were flowers blooming in window boxes, children's laughter echoing from the barn, and the kind of comfortable domesticity that made a house feel like a true home. Josh stood on his front porch, watching Elena hang laundry on the line, while Ivy and Rose helped by handing her clothespins and chattering about everything and nothing in the way that children do when they feel completely safe. The transformation in all their lives still amazed him, not just in the obvious ways, but in the small daily miracles that had accumulated into something that felt remarkably like the happiness he had thought was lost to him forever. The handmade quilt that lay across their bed had become the symbol of their woven lives. Elena had started it during their first month together, involving the girls in choosing colors and patterns, teaching them the traditional stitches her grandmother had passed down through generations of Mexican women. Each square told a story. A piece of Ivy's outgrown dress here, a scrap from Rose's favorite apron there, combined with fabric from Joss's old work shirts and Elena's wedding dress. It's not just about staying warm, Elena had explained to the girls as they worked on it together during the long winter evenings. A quilt tells the story of a family. Every piece has meaning, and when you put them all together, they become stronger than any single piece could be alone. The girls had embraced the project with enthusiasm, their small fingers learning to make neat, even stitches under Eleanor's patient guidance. Joss often found himself drawn to watch these sessions, marveling at how naturally Elena had assumed the role of teacher and guide, how seamlessly she had woven herself into the fabric of their daily life. Now, as spring moved toward summer, the completed quilt served as a tangible reminder of how far they had all traveled from those desperate February days when their future had seemed so uncertain. "Papa Joss," Rose called from the clothesline, using the name that had evolved naturally over the months. "Elena says we can have a picnic by the creek if you don't have too much work today." Joss smiled at the easy way she combined both languages and both parents in a single sentence. The girls had taken to Eleanor's Spanish lessons with the same enthusiasm they brought to everything else, and the house now rang with a mixture of English and Spanish that reflected their blended heritage. "I think a picnic sounds perfect," Joss called back, earning delighted squeals from both girls. Elena looked up from her work, her face showing the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where one belongs. Their marriage had evolved in ways neither of them had expected, not into the passionate romance of storybooks, but into something deeper and more enduring, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection that had grown stronger with each passing day. "You spoil them," Elena said with mock severity as the girls ran off to gather picnic supplies. "They deserve spoiling," Joss replied, meaning it completely. "They've earned every bit of happiness they can get." Elena nodded, understanding the depth of emotion behind his simple words. She had learned the girls' history gradually, piece by piece, as trust and comfort allowed them to share their memories. The abandoned wooden crate where Joss had first found them had become part of family legend, a symbol of how the worst circumstances could sometimes lead to the greatest blessings. That evening, after a perfect day spent by the creek, watching the girls chase butterflies and build elaborate stick fortresses, the family gathered around their kitchen table for the evening routine that had become as natural as breathing. Elena served her famous tortillas, while Joss read aloud from one of the books Henry Brennan had ordered specially from back east, stories of adventure and discovery that captured the girls' imagination and sent them to bed with heads full of dreams. "Read the one about the princess." "And the dragon again," Rose requested, snuggling into Elena's lap with the casual affection of a child who had never questioned her right to comfort and love. "Tomorrow night," Joss promised. "Tonight, I thought we might start a new story, one about a brave explorer who discovers a hidden valley where families are made not just by blood, but by choice and love. Ivy looked up from the wooden horse she still treasured, now joined by an entire carved menagerie that Joss had created during the long winter months. "Is it a true story?" she asked. Joss met Elena's eyes across the table, seeing understanding and agreement there. "It's the truest story I know," he said quietly. As the girls prepared for bed, Elena and Joss stood together on the front porch, looking out over land that had become truly theirs, not just legally but emotionally. The ranch that had once been a hermitage for a grieving man had become a sanctuary for a family that had found each other against all odds. "Do you ever regret it?" Joss asked quietly, though he was almost certain he knew the answer. Elena was silent for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret that it took tragedy to bring us together," she said finally. "I regret that the girls had to suffer before they found safety. But regret marrying you, becoming part of this family? Never." From inside the house came the sound of the girls' whispered conversation as they settled into sleep, their voices carrying the peaceful contentment of children who knew they were loved and protected. Josh thought of the leather journal he had been writing in regularly again, documenting not grief this time, but gratitude, for second chances, for unexpected love, for the miracle of a family formed, not by conventional means, but by the deeper bonds of choice and commitment. The handmade quilt on their bed waited for them, its carefully stitched squares telling the story of their first year together. Tomorrow Elena would teach the girls a new pattern. Joss would carve another animal for their growing collection, and they would continue building the kind of life that proved love could triumph over bureaucracy. Hope could overcome despair, and families could be made in the most unexpected ways. As they prepared to go inside, Joss took one last look at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, other children might be waiting on wooden crates of their own, hoping for someone to find them and offer them safety. Other lonely adults might be wondering if their capacity for love had died with their losses. Joss had learned that love was not a finite resource, but something that multiplied when shared, that families could be formed by circumstances as easily as by blood, and that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the most impossible challenges. The quilt that awaited them inside had been made with careful stitches and patient hands, each piece deliberately chosen and lovingly placed. Like their family itself, it was not perfect. There were crooked seams and mismatched colors, but it was strong, warm, and beautiful in its own unique way. It would last for generations, telling the story of how three broken people had found wholeness together, and how love had proven stronger than law, deeper than convention, and more enduring than anyone had dared to hope.